Now we can look at how we look at the factors that is demand. So we can define demand as the quantity of the commodity that consumers are willing and able to buy at a price over a given period of time. That is what time demand as. It is simply the quantity of a commodity that consumers are willing and able to purchase at a given price over a given period of time. Now, there are two key terms that you need to understand in that definition. We have the willingness and the ability. The consumer must be willing and able to buy for demand to arise. Otherwise, there could be no demand without willingness or with the ability to buy. Distinguish between demand and wants. Now, demands are human desires reflect by the to pay. So for demand to exist, the consumer must be able to pay. That is, they must have the ability to pay. And of course, they must be willing to pay. Now, on the other hand, wants are simply human needs. They may not be backed by ability to pay, but they are there, they exist. Now, having defined demand, what are the factors that influence demand? So we have quite of factors that influence the quantity demand of a commodity. And one of the key factors is the price of the commodity itself. Now, we can analyze the price of the commodity by looking at the law of demand. Now, what the law of demand says is that holding other things constant. So if we hold other things constant, as the price increases, quantity demanded reduces, and as price falls, more is needed. So that means that there is an inverse relationship between the quantity demanded and the price. So if we hold other things constant, then our price will increase in the quantity demand, and increase in the price is simply to all in the quantity demanded. Of course, holding other things constant. So the other thing we keep referring to are other factors that affect the demand. So the price is not the only factor that affects demand. So the law of demand, that is what it says, that price reduces, more is demanded. And as price increases, less is demanded. Both hold other things. The relationship between the price and the quantity demanded is illustrated in. So you can see the demand curve that is illustrated on that diagram. So it is downward sloping. So if you read that law of demand, it simply shows an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. So if we have different combinations of price and the quantities demanded, and the result will have a downward slope demand curve. See what happens at the different levels of the price. So if price reduces or increase, then if we assume that the price reduces, for example, from P to P1, the quantity demanded will also increase from Q1 to Q, which simply shows the inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. So you can see that the demand curve slopes towards left to right, which shows that higher prices, less is demand, and at low prices, more is demand. Now we can conclude that for a normal good or a demand curve, less is demanded at higher prices and more is demanded at low prices. So I've said that demand curve is downward sloping, or in simple terms, the slope of the demand curve is negative. So what are the reasons why the demand curve slopes downwards? Now, one of the reasons why the demand curve slopes downwards is that if you lower the price, this will bring in new buyers who were unable to at the previous price. It means the quantity now more people to buy the goods. Now, the other reason why the demand curve slopes downwards is the reduction of the price may induce or coax out some to purchase by each of the initial consumers of the goods. And in the price may lead to reduction in purchase, and naturally consumers will try to substitute the commodity with another one. It slopes downwards. But you also need to note that a fall in the price is rise in income. So it means that the income of that consumer has increased in real terms, and they can therefore buy more goods. That means the purchasing power, the purchasing ability of the consumer has increased when the price falls. So this means that the consumer will be able to buy if the price falls. That's why the demand curve slopes downwards. Now, if you recall what that demand says, so we said an increase in price will lead to a reduction in the demanded, and a reduction in price will lead to an increase in the quantity demanded. We have some exceptions to that law of demand. So there are some exceptions to the law of demand. That means that it's not every case where an increase in price leads to a fall in the quantity demanded. So we have cases where an increase in the price will lead to an increase in the quantity demanded, or where the price falls, then the quantity demanded also falls. So those exceptions to the law of demand, and we have three cases of those exceptions to the law of demand. Is in case of given goods. So for given goods, they don't the law of demand. And these given goods are inferior goods for which demand increases as the price rises and it decreases as the price falls. So in case of the inferior goods, they don't obey that price because as the price of those rises, quantity demanded for them also increases, and therefore they violate that law of demand. Now the demand curve for such goods is actually upward sloping. It slopes upwards from left to right, so which simply shows income more is demanded. Now the second exception to the law of demand is in case of pipeline goods. So those goods ostentation, or in other words, they are luxury goods. In case of luxury goods, and you know who consumes these luxury goods. So the luxury goods are normally consumed those people who are in the society. They are mindful of status in society, and they normally believe that those goods that are a high price, they have to distinguish them from other consumers in the society. And therefore, if the price of such increases, this kind of consumers are likely to increase quantity of such goods that they consume because they want to distinguish themselves from other consumers in society. Therefore, the demand curve will slope upwards. So if there is a firm that sells goods, the firm will realize the demand increases, the price goes up. So the examples of such goods, we have jewelry, luxury. So the luxury is not everyone who can drive vehicles, but those people who are very wealthy in the society, they prefer such kind of vehicles because it distinguishes them from other consumers in the society. Now, pipeline goods should say the higher the price, the higher the quantity demanded. The other case that will also violate the law of demand is fear of future increase in the prices. Now, if we have some information that price is increasing in future, now as a consumer, what you can do is simply to buy more to avoid paying more prices in future. So the consumer will simply increase the quantity of such goods that he buys so that can avoid paying higher prices in the future. That means that if the price of such goods increases gradually, more is likely to be people who have fear of paying higher prices in the and therefore they will buy in large quantities to stock so that they can avoid paying higher prices in the future. Now, those are the three exceptional cases that we have which do not obey the law of demand. Now, the demand curve for such goods is upward sloping. So we have, for example, kind of demand curve is upward. Suppose price is at that point, you can see what happens. From point P to the quantity demanded will also increase from Q to Q2 to Q1. That shows that those goods do not obey the of demand that we have stated. Now, it's also important to mention something about shifts in the curve. So far, we have only discussed the price as a factor that influences what? Demand. Now, when the price change, the price of the commodity changes, the consumer will simply move along the same demand curve. So the consumer will simply consume along the demand curve. That simply means that movement along the demand curve is caused by a change in the price of the commodity. When the price of the commodity changes, the consumer moves along the same demand curve. So that means it can move upwards or it can move downwards. Now the upward movement is called an increase in price. The movement is caused by a fall in the price. By the following diagram, so we have a downward sloping curve, demand curve, P1 and P2. So P2 is up. So the price is at 2 consumes at A, which corresponds to Q1, the quantity. So if it falls to P1, so the consumer will simply move along the same what? Demand curve and consumes at point P. That is what we call movement along the demand curve. And that movement along the demand curve, I've said, is caused by the changes in the movement from point B to A is caused by an increase in the price. So if the price in example, an increase in the price, the consumer will move from point B to point A. If a decrease in the price, consumer will move point A to point B. Is called the price. the fall from P1 to P2, sorry, from P2 to P1 will lead to an increase in the quantity demanded from Q1 to Q2. That is what we refer to as a movement along the demand curve. Now, in the case of a shift in the demand curve, the demand to a new position. Now, the demand curve can shift upwards or downwards. And the shift in the demand curve is caused by a change in other factors that influence demand other than the price of the commodity. So it is important that you understand what causes a shift in the demand curve. So apart from the price of the commodity will cause a shift in the demand curve. So we will continue to analyze the other factors which we have not discussed. We have analyzed the price only as a factor that influences the demand. So the other factors that follow will cause a shift in the demand curve. Now, a shift of the demand curve is caused by a change in other factors in the demand. Now, this shift can either be to the left or to the right. If the curve shifts to the left, it means that there is a fall in demand. So upward shift in the demand curve implies a fall in the demand. And the rightward shift simply shows an increase in the demand. So you can see the term that follows. So we have a demand curve indicated by D, that is the demand curve. Now, the shift D1. So if the demand curve shifts to D1, so it simply shows an increase in demand. So if the price remains unchanged, you can see the effect. So this is the price. So we have quantity, this Q1. We have another quantity here, which is Q2. So we have the last one, you can Q3. What happens? The price remains, but the demand to the right. If it shifts to the right, it shows an increase in the quantity demanded. Now, the quantity demanded, sorry, this one, the original quantity is, we can indicate it Q naught. So increase in the quantity demanded is represented Q3 because the demand curve shifts to the right. And if it shifts, it means that the quantity demanded has reduced now from Q naught to Q2. That is what we refer to as shifts in the demand curve, and they are caused by a change in other factors apart from the price. They do not cause a shift in the curve. Now, the second factor that we can discuss which influence the demand for a commodity is the price of other related commodities. So the price of other related commodities can affect the demand for a given commodity. Now, goods can be in two ways. They can be substitutes or they are complements. Now, if a fall in the price of one commodity lowers the quantity of the other commodity, the two commodities are said to be substitutes. So for substitute goods, these are the goods that can be used in place of each other. And if price of one commodity increases relative to the other, quantity of the commodity whose price has increased will fall, while quantity demand for the other commodity will increase. If we have goods, we have one. As the price of X increases, the quantity demanded of commodity Y will increase because the two goods are substitutes. That is, they can be in place of each other. So in case of substitute goods, demand other commodity will increase. Now, if a fall in the price of one commodity rises, the quantity demanded of the other commodity are said to be, the two commodities are simply said to be complements. Now, for complements, they are together. The petrol without. So if the price of cars increases, we expect few cars on the road, and for the petrol will fall. Goods, and a change in the price would simply affect the demand for other. So we have a case where an increase in the price will lead to a fall in the demand for the other. And we have a case where an increase or a decrease in the price of one will lead to an increase in the demand for the other. So the second diagram shows that case for complements. If the price falls, then the quantity demanded for the other will increase. The price of one increase of one commodity increases of subs, then the quantity demanded will simply fall, which is illustrated by diagram. The first graph, this one, simply slopes upwards, which indicates that as the price of a substitute falls, the quantity demand would falls. So the two goods. The second graph is downward sloping, indicating that as the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. Therefore, the goods, that is X and O, they are referred to as complements. Now that is how the price of other related commodities affect the quantity demanded. Now the third factor that also affects the quantity is the income. Consumer is also a key determinant of the quantity demand. Now also behave when you have your or when you are in generally. Expect that an increase in will also lead to an increase in the quantity demanded for goods, services. Now, the goods that obey the rule are called normal goods. So the normal goods increases, the quantity demanded also increases. So this will be referred to as the normal goods. We also have some where an increase in income will lead to a fall in the quantity demanded. Now, such goods are referred to as inferior goods. So for inferior goods, an increase in income leads to fall in quantity demand. And we also have other cases where a change in the income leaves the quantity demanded completely unaffected. Now, in case of other commodities, an increase in income will lead to a fall in the quantity demanded. I've said those goods are referred to as inferior goods. Now, the relationship between income and the quantity demanded is illustrated by the use of an angel curve. So the angel's curve is simply a that shows the relationship between and quantity demanded. So you can see at various levels of income, we have a different quantity that can be demanded. So at the levels of income, we have different levels of the commodities that are needed. So that's referred to as the angel's curve. So it's a relationship between the quantity demanded and level of income. Now the curve simply shows the relationship between the income and quantity demanded. And of course, in this case, we include other factors. Now the angel curve for normal moves upwards, which simply shows that as income increases, quantity demanded will also increase. But for inferior goods, curve slopes downwards, which shows that as the income increases, demand for such goods falls. Now the other factor which also influences the quantity demanded is differences. So this one also plays a key role in determining the quantity demanded. Preferences for a given commodity changes favorably. Expect the quantity demanded in this. However, unfavorable change in tastes and preferences will reduce the quantity of the commodity demanded. So if tastes and preferences are favorable for a given commodity, we expect more to be demanded. But if the change is unfavorable, then the demanded will reduce. So the other factor, number 4, is number 5, that affects the quantity demanded is advertisement. Now, a successful advertising campaign is expected to increase the quantity demanded. So if some advertising campaign, this will create a demand for its while reducing the demand for other competing products. So advertising is likely to increase the demanded of commodity among the consumers on the commodity, and this will reduce the demand for competing products. So advertising influence on the quantity demanded. Firms best on advertising. Advertising, some firms plays a very key role in influencing the demand of their products. So the other factor that you can also mention is the consumer expectations about future price. So we have mentioned this earlier under exceptions to the of demand. And I said that if the consumer perceives or expects to increase in the future, then they are likely to buy more of the commodity and stock so that they can avoid paying more prices in the future. So in this case, the quantity demanded will increase. But we expect all in the price in the future will cause the demand for such commodities to fall. Presently, expected that in the future the prices of that commodity will fall, then definitely the demand for such commodity at the moment will fall. And this will reduce the quantity needed. So in this case, the demand simply becomes less. Now, lastly, we have the size of the population and also affect the quantity demanded of the commodity. Large or a greater size population, an increase in the quantity demanded. So if the population is less, it means the consumers in the market will demand less and reduce quantity demand of commodity. And also the population will also determine the demand for specific goods. So the composition in terms of age and the sex will also determine the demand for specific goods. Now, these are the factors that determine the demand for commodity. I think we have exhausted factors that determine or influence the demand for the commodity.